Well, today's news is a scorcher, and I don't just mean figuratively. We're talking record-breaking heat, wildfires raging across Los Angeles. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. We've got reports coming in from everywhere. The New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, even scientific journals are weighing in.
So 2024 is officially the hottest year ever recorded. And it's not just a few degrees warmer. We've crossed a critical climate threshold, haven't we?
Right, the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. That was a key target set by the Paris Climate Agreement to try and limit global warming. Exceeding it means a much higher risk of those irreversible climate changes like melting ice sheets and rising sea levels.
Wow, I remember learning about that, but it seemed so theoretical back then. Now it's happened. And we're seeing the impacts play out right now with the Los Angeles wildfire.
Absolutely. These fires are fueled by a dangerous mix of factors. It's important to understand how they all connect. We've got those Santa Ana winds. They're powerful, dry winds that blow down from the mountains and basically turn the whole area into a tinderbox.
Wait, hold on. For those of us who aren't from California, can you explain what makes Santa Ana winds so unique, so dangerous?
Sure. So they originate in the Great Basin, a high-pressure zone east of California. As those winds descend towards the coast, they get compressed and heated, they become extremely dry and gusty, and they can turn small sparks into massive infernos just like that.
Okay, so you've got these like supercharged winds, and then you add bone-dry conditions and all that parched vegetation. It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And the Washington Post is reporting over 1,000 structures destroyed already, mass evacuations happening all across LA.
It's heartbreaking to see the images. People are losing their homes, their livelihoods, and tragically, lives are being lost too. The Daily Climate says there are already at least 5 fatalities.
And that brings up a point that I think is often overlooked, the human cost. Beyond the physical damage, there's trauma, displacement, and the long-term health impacts of smoke inhalation, especially for vulnerable populations. The Guardian has a powerful piece on how all of this is affecting those experiencing homelessness.
It's easy to focus on the numbers, the acres burned, the economic damage, but we can't forget the individual stories of loss and suffering.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand that these fires aren't just a natural disaster. Yes, you have the Santa Ana winds and the dry conditions. But climate change is making those factors worse. The fires become larger, more intense, and much harder to control.
So climate change is like it's turning up the heat on an already dangerous situation.
Precisely. And that leads to another concern. A new study in the conversation is highlighting what they're calling weather whiplash. It explains how climate change is disrupting weather patterns, causing swings between very wet and very dry periods.
So one year, torrential rains, and the next, you're bone dry and primed for wildfires. That's chaos.
It is. It's not just the immediate impact either. This kind of weather whiplash makes planning and adapting incredibly difficult. How do you prepare for floods and droughts at the same time? How do you manage water resources when you're constantly swinging back and forth?
That's a good point. And speaking of water, the LA Times mentioned issues with dry fire hydrants. Low water pressure is making it even harder for firefighters to battle these blazes.
Right, and this raises the question of infrastructure resilience. Are our cities actually prepared to handle the combined effects of climate change? Are we investing enough in water management, fire suppression, disaster preparedness in general?
Doesn't sound like it.
Well, it's not a simple answer, but these wildfires have exposed some serious vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities aren't just in Los Angeles. They're in cities around the world facing similar threats from climate change.
And it often takes a disaster like this to highlight them.
It's true. That's why it's so vital to learn from what's happening, adapt our infrastructure, and build more resilient communities that can actually withstand the challenges of a changing climate.
So we have record-breaking heat, wildfires, and infrastructure failures. But the story doesn't end there, does it? The political side of this crisis is heating up too.
It is. And as we've seen before, climate change often becomes a political football. Each side blames the other instead of working together to find solutions.
Right, we're seeing it again now. E&E News and the Washington Post report that President-elect Trump is blaming California's leaders for the fires and even threatening to withhold disaster aid.
Exactly. And that kind of political posturing just adds another layer of complexity to a situation that's already incredibly difficult. It can hinder relief efforts and slow down progress on long-term solutions to climate change.
It's frustrating. We're facing this unprecedented global challenge, and we're letting political divisions get in the way of meaningful action.
It is a concern, but it also reminds us that we can't afford to be complacent. We need to hold our leaders accountable, demand action, and work together to build a more sustainable future.
So it's about turning that frustration into something constructive. Speaking of which, what can people actually do to make a difference in this crisis?
That's a great question. One we'll definitely dig into further. But before we do, let's step back and think about the global implications. 2024 exceeding that 1.5-degree threshold, that isn't just about hotter summers. It's about a cascade of consequences for the entire planet.
Right. This is a global issue. Los Angeles is just one example of how those impacts are playing out in real time. So when we come back, let's zoom out and explore those broader implications and what they mean for the future.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about 2024 exceeding that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold. And it's not just a number in a report, it means we're entering this new era of climate extremes. And what's happening in Los Angeles, it really gives us a glimpse of what that future could look like.
It can feel overwhelming. We've got these immediate crises like those wildfires, but then there's this looming threat of even bigger changes down the road. Hard to wrap your head around it all.
I get it, it's a lot to process. But the situation is serious, but it's not hopeless. We still have time to act. We can mitigate the worst effects of climate change and adapt to the changes that are already here.
Okay, so let's focus on that. What can we do on a global scale to get things back on track?
Well, the first step is admitting there's a problem and committing to action. The Paris Climate Agreement wasn't perfect, but it was a big step in the right direction. Almost 200 countries came together with the shared goal of limiting global warming.
But haven't we already blown past those targets? We just talked about exceeding that 1.5-degree limit.
True, we have. But the agreement also has a way for countries to increase their commitments over time. And there are some positive developments. The Daily Climate, for instance. They report on more and more countries and businesses pledging to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
So there's a chance to change course, to bend that curve, so to speak.
Absolutely. But it requires bold action. And it requires action now. The longer we wait, the harder and more expensive it'll be to fix the problem.
Okay, so what are some of those bold actions? What needs to happen globally to tackle this?
One key area is shifting away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. Things like solar, wind, geothermal. Canary Media has some really interesting reporting on the advancements in those renewable energy technologies and how the costs are going down.
That's good to hear. It seems like not that long ago, renewable energy was this fringe idea, but now it's becoming mainstream. But is it happening fast enough? We're still burning a lot of coal and oil.
That's the million-dollar question. The transition is happening, but it needs to be much faster. And that needs government policies that encourage clean energy development and discourage fossil fuel use. Things like carbon pricing, carbon taxes or cap-and-trade system.
Right, putting a price on pollution. But those policies, they're often politically controversial, right?
They can be, but they're also becoming more common. A lot of countries, even some states and cities, are already doing it. And there's more and more evidence that these policies can actually reduce emissions without hurting economic growth.
Okay, so we need to transition to clean energy, and we need policies that support that transition. But what about adapting to the changes that are already here? We can't just ignore things like the wildfires and extreme weather we're already seeing.
You're absolutely right. Adaptation is just as important as mitigation. It means investing in infrastructure that's more resilient, developing early warning systems for those extreme weather events, finding ways to manage water better when there are droughts.
So building seawalls to protect coastal areas from rising seas, developing drought-resistant crops, creating better irrigation systems, things like that.
Exactly. It also means considering the social side of adaptation. How do we make sure the most vulnerable communities have the resources and support they need to deal with climate impacts? How do we create a fairer world in the face of these challenges?
Those are important questions. It's easy to focus on the technology and economics of climate change, but we have to remember the human element, the people who are already being hit hardest by this crisis.
Absolutely. Climate change is, at its core, a human issue. It's about the choices we make, the values we have, and the future we're building for ourselves and the generations to come.
Okay, so we've talked about bold action on mitigation and adaptation, but it seems like there's a gap between what needs to be done and what's actually happening. Why is it so hard to make progress on this?
Well, there are a few things going on. One is just the size and complexity of the problem. Climate change is global and needs everyone to work together. governments, businesses, individuals, everyone.
Right. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and fix it.
Exactly. And then there's a political will. People are becoming more aware of how urgent the climate crisis is, but there's still resistance to changing things, especially from those who benefit from how things are now.
Like the fossil fuel industry.
Yes, they have a lot to lose if we move away from fossil fuels, and they have a lot of influence. But it's not just them, it's also about overcoming inertia, about challenging the way things have always been done.
It's like trying to turn a giant ship around. It takes time and effort.
Good analogy, but I think we're starting to see that ship turn, even if it's slow. The momentum for climate action is growing. More people are demanding change, and more leaders, businesses, investors, they're realizing we need to act.
So there's hope, but there's urgency too. We need to keep pushing for change now.
Exactly. The window of opportunity is closing. The choices we make in the next few years will determine the future. But it's not just about policies and technology, it's also about our individual choices. How we live, what we consume, how we interact with the world around us.
So it's not just about what governments and businesses do. It's about what we do in our own lives. What are some things people can do to make a difference?
There's a lot we can do, and every little bit counts. We can reduce our energy use. Take public transit, bike, walk, carpool more, choose energy-efficient appliances and light bulbs, eat less meat that has a big carbon footprint, support businesses that are doing something about climate change.
It's about making conscious choices, thinking about the impact of our actions. But it's also about using our voices, right? Speaking up, demanding change, holding our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. Our voices matter. We need to keep the pressure on our leaders to take action on the climate crisis. We need to talk to our friends, family, communities, and we need to support the people and organizations who are fighting for a more sustainable future.
So individual action, collective action, political action, changing our behavior, changing the systems, changing the conversation.
Well put. It's about realizing we're all in this together. The climate crisis affects everyone, and it'll take everyone to solve it.
You know, something that stood out in our research was the power of community in a crisis. The New York Times had a piece about how communities in Los Angeles are coming together to help those affected by the wildfires. It shows that even when things are really tough, human connection can make us stronger.
I agree. Connecting with others, sharing our worries, working towards a shared goal, it can be healing. It makes us feel less alone, less overwhelmed, more hopeful, reminds us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
It's about finding strength in numbers, knowing we're not alone, and using that energy to do something positive.
Exactly. And celebrating the wins, even the small ones. We need to recognize and appreciate the progress that's being made, even as we keep pushing for more.
Well said. So for our listeners who are feeling overwhelmed or anxious about the climate crisis, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them?
I'd say first, acknowledge your feelings. It's okay to be scared, angry, sad. Don't bottle those emotions up. Talk to someone, join a support group, or find a therapist if you need to. And then find a way to turn those feelings into action.
What kind of action?
Anything that feels right for you. Reduce your carbon footprint, volunteer for an environmental group, support businesses that are taking climate action, advocate for policy changes.
So find what speaks to you, what you're passionate about, and go for it.
Exactly. Find your own way to make a difference. Remember, every action, no matter how small, adds to the collective effort.
Well, on that note of hope and empowerment, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. It's been a heavy topic, but I think it's important to have these conversations, to understand the challenges we face, but also to see the solutions and the reasons for hope.
I agree completely. The climate crisis is a huge challenge, but we can overcome it. We have the knowledge, the technology, and the will to create a future that's sustainable and just. It's up to us to make it happen.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of the solution. Welcome back. We were talking about the emotional weight of the climate crisis, the anxiety, the fear, the grief. It's a lot, especially with all the news about extreme weather, melting glaciers, and those dire warnings from scientists.
It makes sense that people feel overwhelmed. The scale of it all, it's daunting. The stakes are so high. The future of the planet, the well-being of future generations, it's a heavy load.
And it's not just the future, is it? We see the impacts right now. People losing their homes, livelihoods, even their lives. That's got to be incredibly traumatic.
It is. And there's a growing awareness of the mental health toll of climate change. We mentioned it earlier, but there's actually a term for it now, climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, that feeling of dread, helplessness, knowing the planet's in danger.
I felt that myself. The kind of creeping dread, like this dark cloud. It's hard to stay positive with all the images of destruction, the projections of things getting even worse.
It's a normal reaction to these kinds of threats. Our brains are wired to notice danger to try and avoid harm. But when the threat is like climate change, so big and complicated, it's tough to know how to process those feelings, how to deal with the anxiety.
So what can we do? Are we just stuck with anxiety and despair?
Not at all. We have to acknowledge those feelings, let ourselves grieve for what's being lost, but we can't let those emotions paralyze us. I think the key to dealing with climate anxiety is action.
Action. How does that help with the anxiety?
When we feel helpless, it's easy to fall into negative thinking. But when we take action, even small things, it makes us feel more empowered, more hopeful. It gives us a sense of agency, a feeling that we're making a difference, even if it's small.
It's like that saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. We can't fix the whole climate crisis at once, but we can make changes in our lives, support organizations working on solutions, speak up and demand action from our leaders.
Exactly. And it's not just about the direct impact of those actions, it's the change in our mindset. When we're active, we're not just victims of circumstance, we're shaping the future.
That's powerful, not just waiting for someone else to fix things, but being part of the solution.
Absolutely. And we're not alone in this. There are so many people and groups all over the world working on this. Scientists, activists, policymakers, entrepreneurs. We need to join forces, amplify their efforts, build a movement that can't be ignored.
One thing that stuck with me from our research was the importance of community in a crisis. The New York Times had this article about how communities in LA are coming together to help people affected by the wildfires. It reminds us that even with these huge challenges, human connection is a source of strength.
I agree. Connecting with others, sharing our concerns, working together towards a goal, it can be really therapeutic. We feel less alone, less overwhelmed, more hopeful. We're part of something bigger.
Strength in numbers, knowing we're not alone, and using that energy to do something good.
Exactly. And celebrating the victories, even the small ones. Recognizing and appreciating the progress we're making, even as we keep pushing for more.
Well said. So, for our listeners feeling overwhelmed or anxious about the climate crisis, what would you say to them? What advice would you give?
I'd say first, don't ignore your feelings. It's okay to be scared, angry, sad. Don't bottle it up. Talk to someone, a support group, maybe even a therapist. And then find a way to channel those feelings into action.
What kind of action?
Whatever feels meaningful to you. Reduce your own impact. Volunteer for an environmental group. Support climate-conscious businesses. Advocate for policy changes.
Find what speaks to you, what you're passionate about, and go for it.
Exactly. Find your way to make a difference. And remember, every action, big or small, contributes to the bigger picture.
Well, on that note of hope and empowerment, we're wrapping up this episode of The Deep Dive. It was a heavy topic, but these conversations are so important to understand the challenges, but also the solutions and reasons for hope.
I couldn't agree more. The climate crisis is the defining challenge of our time, but we can overcome it. We have the knowledge, the technology, the will to create a sustainable, just future. It's up to us to make it happen.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of the solution.